August 3rd, 1943. A U.S. Army field hospital outside Nicosia, Sicily. The fighting in Sicily had dragged on for weeks, and the tents were full. Men with shrapnel wounds lay beside men who hadn't slept in days. The air smelled of antiseptics, sweat, and dust from the nearby road. That afternoon, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. walked through one of the wards during an inspection. He stopped beside the bed of Private Charles Cool. Cool wasn't bleeding. He hadn't lost a limb. His chart listed combat exhaustion, nervous fatigue. When Patton asked why he was there, Cool began to cry. He said he couldn't go back to the front. Several nurses later said Patton's mood changed immediately. He raised his voice. He called the soldier a coward, a disgrace to the uniform. Then, in front of doctors, nurses, and other wounded men, Patton slapped him across the face with his gloves. No one intervened. 4 days later, on August 7th, Patton entered another field hospital near San Stefano. There, he confronted Private Paul Bennett, whose diagnosis was the same. Bennett admitted he was afraid. According to the hospital commander's report, Patton slapped the soldier, grabbed his collar, and ordered him back to the front. This time, the staff spoke up. Doctors filed complaints. Nurses submitted sworn statements. Names, dates, and witness accounts were recorded and sent up the chain of command. By August 10th, the reports reached Allied headquarters and were forwarded to General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The file described a senior American commander striking wounded soldiers in wartime. It came from Patton's own officers, men who served under him, men who depended on his approval, men who knew what reporting him could cost. Inside headquarters, the reports were read quietly. No public statement followed. But the danger was clear. If the story became public, morale could collapse. If it was ignored, discipline could collapse. And if Patton was punished, the Army could lose one of its most aggressive commanders. Patton knew none of this. He was still issuing orders, still planning future operations, still assuming his authority was intact. He didn't know that senior officers were meeting behind closed doors. And he didn't know that one question now followed his name through headquarters. Was this the end of George Patton's career? What happened next was decided in secret. By mid-August 1943, nothing had been announced. There was no official statement, no disciplinary order, no public investigation. On paper, everything looked normal. Patton's name still appeared on operational plans. His headquarters was still running. Daily bulletins mentioned no problem. But inside Allied headquarters, things felt different. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Legal officers quietly reviewed reports. Staff members drafted statements that were never released. None of this reached ordinary soldiers. Instead, news spread through rumors. Staff officers noticed Patton was no longer invited to certain briefings. Some planning sessions went ahead without him. Restricted documents began circulating in new offices. In mess tents and command posts, questions followed. Had Eisenhower decided to remove him? Was a court-martial coming? Had Washington stepped in? Or was it being buried? No one knew. Senior officers sent memos asking for guidance. Replies were vague. Some never came. Cables moved between North Africa, London, and Washington. Lawyers reviewed regulations. Advisors worried about public reaction. Intelligence officers warned about enemy propaganda. Still, no decision appeared. Even Patton's own staff were left guessing. When they called headquarters, they were redirected. When they contacted Washington, they heard nothing. Patton noticed changes. Orders arrived late. Meetings were canceled. Certain reports stopped reaching his desk. In his diary, he wrote that something felt wrong, but no one would explain it. Officially, he remained a senior commander. Unofficially, he was being watched. Inside the War Department, officials debated their options. Punish him and weaken operations. Protect him and lose credibility. Ignore it and invite future problems. By late August, one phrase kept appearing. Washington is watching. Every move was being noticed. Every mistake recorded. Every decision judged. Patton believed his record would protect him. He believed his victories were enough. He believed the worst was over. But the real danger hadn't reached him yet, and he didn't know it was coming. On paper, George S. Patton Jr. was exactly the kind of commander the Army valued in wartime. He moved fast. He demanded results. His units trained harder than most, and he expected strict discipline without hesitation. Patton believed fear had a purpose. He believed weakness spread. He believed hesitation got people killed. To the public, he looked certain and unshakable. Newspapers described him as ruthless, fearless, built for war. But that wasn't the whole man. In private, Patton was far more uncertain. He prayed every night and carried a small prayer book. His diary entries from 1943 show him asking God for strength and worrying about whether he was equal to his responsibilities. He wrote constantly. In letters to his wife, Beatrice, he admitted fears he never showed his staff. He worried about failure, embarrassment, and damaging his family's military reputation. In July 1943, weeks before the hospital incident, he wrote that he feared being remembered not for success, but for disgrace. Physically, he was worn down. During the Sicilian campaign, Patton slept only a few hours most nights. He ignored advice to rest and complained of headaches and stomach problems caused by stress. He was also sensitive to criticism. His private writings show him dwelling on negative reports and worrying about how his superiors viewed him. He believed one mistake could erase years of achievement. In public, he projected confidence. In private, he felt exposed. That tension shaped his behavior. His strict discipline came from fear of disorder. His anger came from fear of losing control. His intolerance for weakness came from fear of failure. The hospital incident did not come from indifference. It came from a man under pressure, afraid of losing authority and afraid of how history might judge him. Most people around Patton never saw this side of him. They saw the speeches and the uniform. They did not see the doubts written late at night. They did not see the strain building over time. And that hidden side of Patton was about to matter more than anyone realized. Before Sicily, before the hospital reports, and before quiet meetings in headquarters, Patton's private life followed a familiar pattern. It can still be seen in his letters. Throughout 1942 and 1943, he wrote regularly to his wife Beatrice. Many were written late at night, after long days of planning and inspections in small tents lit by a single lamp. They were not about glory. They were about ordinary life. He wrote about heat and dust, about bad food and broken equipment, about being tired. He asked about home repairs, family friends, and whether his mail was arriving. In one letter from June 1943, he told her that hearing from her was the only thing that made him feel calm. These details mattered. They reminded him that life existed beyond maps and casualty reports. They gave him something normal to hold on to. Patton often returned to the idea that he had been meant for this life. He had grown up surrounded by military history, and from childhood believed he was destined to command soldiers. In his diary, he called war his life's work. Victory was personal. It meant his life had purpose. It meant the sacrifices were justified. But alongside that ambition was fear. In private letters, he worried about disgrace, being removed from command, and being remembered for failure. In the spring of 1943, he wrote that he feared losing honor more than dying. As the Sicilian campaign wore on, his tone changed. By July, his letters were shorter. By August, they were careful. He stopped talking about long-term plans. Some letters were delayed, others never arrived. Beatrice noticed. The steady rhythm of their correspondence began to break. Days passed, then weeks. No familiar handwriting, no explanation, no reassurance. In wartime, silence was rarely meaningless. It usually meant something was wrong. And somewhere between Sicily and Allied headquarters, Patton's personal world was beginning to unravel. Soon, that silence would matter more than anyone expected. Once the hospital reports reached Allied headquarters in August 1943, the incident stopped being about Patton's temper. It became a formal case. Copies of the file were sent to legal officers, medical command, and senior staff. Each group reviewed the same statements and saw a different problem. Under Army regulations at the time, officers were forbidden from striking enlisted men. Medical facilities were protected spaces, and decisions about fitness for duty belonged to doctors, not commanders. Patton's actions violated all of those rules. Judge-advocate officers reviewed the evidence, comparing witness accounts with regulations and preparing summaries for senior leaders. Personal opinions were removed. The case was reduced to procedures and violations. At the same time, pressure was building in Washington. War Department officials worried about what would happen if the story became public. The Army was presenting itself as disciplined and professional. A senior general hitting wounded soldiers threatened that image. Press advisors warned reporters would seize on it. Enemy propaganda would exploit it. Politicians would demand answers. Eisenhower now faced a dilemma. As Supreme Allied Commander, he had to enforce discipline. He also had to keep effective commanders in the field. Patton was one of his most aggressive officers. Removing him could weaken future operations. Protecting him could undermine trust across the ranks. Private correspondence shows Eisenhower asking for advice from every side. Lawyers pointed to regulations. Doctors spoke about combat fatigue. Advisors focused on public reaction. No one offered a safe solution. Meanwhile, the paperwork continued. Draft memoranda outlined possible outcomes: reprimand, removal from command, reassignment, or court-martial. Command notes recorded debates over timing and secrecy. With each document, Patton's position narrowed. This was how the system worked. It gathered evidence, applied rules, made decisions. By late August, a recommendation was beginning to form. It would not be announced publicly. It would be delivered quietly through the chain of command. And when it reached Patton, it would make clear the Army had chosen order over personality. What he didn't yet know was how severe that choice would be. In early September 1943, the decision reached George Patton. It did not come with publicity. There was no press release, no court hearing, no public explanation. It came quietly, through private orders. Patton was told to apologize in writing to the soldiers he had struck and to the hospital staff. A formal warning was placed in his file. He was removed from active combat command. Officially, it was described as administrative action. In reality, it was punishment without a trial. He was no longer trusted on the front line. As planning began for the invasion of Western Europe, Patton was left out of operational leadership. While other generals shaped the largest assault in military history, he was assigned inspections, speeches, and ceremonial duties. He appeared at parades. He toured training camps. He attended briefings with no real authority. The general who had driven armies across Sicily was now watching from the sidelines. The contrast was obvious. While Patton waited, Bernard Montgomery was placed in charge of Allied ground forces for the Normandy invasion. His plans were praised, his leadership promoted. Patton was rarely mentioned. Inside headquarters, the reasoning was blunt. He was seen as a risk. Another incident could damage Allied unity. A public scandal could weaken support at home. One mistake could derail months of preparation. So he was kept away from power. For Patton, the effect was devastating. In his diary, he wrote that being sidelined hurt more than physical wounds. He felt discarded and forgotten. He feared his career was ending in disgrace. Meanwhile, younger officers moved ahead. Some of his former subordinates were promoted over him. Men who once worked for him now outranked him. He had to take orders from commanders he had trained. At the same time, he was expected to remain loyal. No complaints, no explanations, no visible anger. There was no appeal, no hearing, no chance to defend himself. The decision was final. Patton faced an impossible choice. If he protested, he would appear undisciplined. If he stayed silent, he would accept humiliation. Either way, he lost. In private, he wrote of anger and fear that everything he had built was slipping away. In public, he obeyed. He saluted. He followed orders. He waited. And as preparations for D-Day moved forward, Patton watched history being made without him, unsure if he would ever be part of it again. By early 1944, Patton was still waiting. Publicly, he remained sidelined. Privately, something else was happening. In January, Allied headquarters assigned him to command the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. On paper, it looked powerful. In reality, it barely existed. FUSAG had no real combat role. Its strength was in paperwork, staged movement, and radio traffic. Its true purpose was deception. Allied planners were preparing to invade France. They needed the Germans to believe the main attack would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. And to make that believable, they needed Patton. German intelligence believed Patton meant attack. Wherever he appeared, they expected an offensive. So the Allies put him at the center of the illusion. In February, Patton wrote that he felt trapped in a meaningless command. He complained about inspections and pointless exercises. At the same time, intelligence reports showed German reconnaissance aircraft focusing on his headquarters. Fake radio messages were sent. Dummy tanks and vehicles were deployed. Later intercepts confirmed the Germans believed he was preparing an invasion. Patton only knew he was still out of combat. In March, Patton asked for a frontline command. Internal memos show the request was denied without explanation. Meanwhile, intercepted communications identified FUSAG as the main invasion force. For Allied planners, this confirmed the deception was working. Patton remained sidelined. In his diary, he wrote that he felt wasted and misused. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. Patton was not involved. While other generals commanded under fire, he stayed in England. Even after the landings, German commanders hesitated. Reports show they still believed Normandy was a diversion. They expected Patton to strike at Calais. For weeks, major units stayed in place. That delay helped Allied forces build strength. Strategically, the deception worked. Personally, it was agonizing. In June, Patton wrote about anger and humiliation. He feared being forgotten. By late July, fighting in Normandy had stalled. Casualties were rising. Progress was slow. Commanders needed a breakthrough. Mid-July planning documents show Patton's name returning. On July 19th, he was listed for command. On July 25th, the breakout began. Within days, Patton was activated. He was given command of the Third Army. After months of waiting and restraint, he was finally released. But intelligence reports warned that German commanders were still focused on Calais. They were still watching his phantom army. The deception had worked almost too well. Patton was returning to battle, while much of the enemy was still looking in the wrong direction. For most of 1943 and into early 1944, Patton believed he had been pushed aside. He believed the hospital incident had damaged his reputation beyond repair. He believed senior commanders no longer trusted him. From his position, there was little reason to think otherwise. He was kept out of major planning meetings. He was denied frontline command. No one explained why. But inside Allied headquarters, a different picture was forming. Planning documents from early 1944 show Patton's name appearing again and again, not in combat roles, but in files tied to deception planning. Intelligence summaries from British and American sources reached the same conclusion. German commanders feared Patton more than any other Allied general. Intercepted messages and prisoner interrogations showed a consistent belief. If Patton was involved, a major attack would follow. Allied planners decided to use that belief. Instead of putting him into battle, they placed him where the enemy could see him. They built an army group around him that existed mostly on paper. They staged movements near his headquarters. They allowed German agents to observe activity around his camps. They generated radio traffic in his name. Everything pointed toward Calais. Nothing pointed toward Normandy. For months, Patton became the centerpiece of a deception operation designed to shape German expectations. And he was never fully told. Even senior officers were given only partial information. The fewer people who knew the full plan, the safer it was. Patton received instructions, not explanations. Stay visible. Stay active. Maintain the appearance of command. Only after the Normandy landing succeeded did the meaning begin to emerge. Post-invasion reports noted successful diversion efforts. German forces had remained near Calais, waiting for an attack that never came. Later records confirmed it. Gradually, the truth became clear. His sidelining had been deliberate. What he had taken as punishment was part of a larger strategy. The army had not lost faith in him. It had hidden him in plain sight. For Patton, the realization was unsettling. Months of anger and doubt suddenly made sense. He had not been removed, he had been preserved, and now that the deception had worked, the restraint was ending. Soon, he would no longer be needed as a symbol. Soon, he would be needed as a commander. And he was about to be released. By July 1944, Patton finally understood what had happened to him. He knew his sidelining had been deliberate. He knew he had been part of a larger deception plan. And he knew that his return to command came with an unspoken condition. He was expected to stay quiet. Diary entries from that summer show a man pulled in two directions. He was relieved to be back in real command, but deeply resentful of how easily he had been set aside. He felt he had been treated unfairly. He also knew he could never say that publicly. If he protested, he would look unstable. If he demanded explanations, he would appear ungrateful. If he criticized his superiors, he would revive doubts about his discipline. But accepting the situation was painful. It meant admitting others had controlled his career. It meant pretending months of humiliation had never happened. It meant abandoning any public defense of his actions in Sicily. In a mid-July 1944 diary entry, Patton wrote that he felt caught between pride and duty. He admitted wanting to confront his superiors and fearing that one wrong word could end everything. The choice was harsh. If he rebelled, he would likely be removed. If he obeyed, he would carry the damage in silence. Either way, he would lose something. At the same time, pressure was growing. Senior officers made it clear, without writing it down, that this was his last chance. Any outburst or complaint would reopen the case. There would be no more protection. No more second chances. Patton understood. His letters changed. Complaints disappeared. He stopped referring to the past. His diary became careful and restrained. Outwardly, he appeared calm and focused. Inwardly, he was struggling. He was choosing between dignity and survival, between defending himself and keeping his command. In the end, he chose silence. He accepted the terms. He buried his anger. He moved forward. But that choice would follow him long after the war. On the morning of July 25, 1944, Allied bombers struck German positions west of St. Lo. The attack began just before 9:40 a.m. The operation was called Cobra. For weeks, American forces had been stalled in Normandy's hedgerows, taking heavy casualties for little ground. Commanders needed a breakthrough. Hundreds of aircraft dropped thousands of tons of bombs along a narrow stretch of the German line. Defensive positions were shattered. Some American units were hit by friendly fire, but the bombardment opened a gap. Behind the front, sealed orders were waiting. 2 days later, on August 1st, just after midnight, those orders were opened. Patton's Third Army became operational. Movement followed immediately. Headquarters units relocated. Communications came online. Supply routes were adjusted. Liaison officers moved to coordinate with neighboring commands. Patton stressed speed. Units were told to bypass resistance and push through openings. Commanders were encouraged to act without waiting for approval. The advance accelerated. German defenses collapsed. Towns fell rapidly. Some divisions covered dozens of miles in a single day. But speed created new problems. Fuel shortages slowed armored units. Supply trucks struggled to keep pace. Some formations halted not because of enemy fire, but because they ran out of gasoline. Patton monitored fuel reports closely. He pressed logistics officers for priority shipments and ordered captured German fuel to be used whenever possible. Staff officers warned that the army was advancing faster than it could be supported. Patton chose to keep moving. He believed stopping would give the enemy time to recover. By mid-August, Third Army had advanced hundreds of miles across France. By the end of the month, it reached the Meuse River. German forces were in retreat. What began as a breakout had become a pursuit. The general sidelined only weeks earlier was now driving the Allied advance, and the pace he set was beginning to strain everything around him. By October 1944, Patton had become one of the most visible commanders in the Allied armies. Newspapers praised his speed. Soldiers talked about his energy. His Third Army had crossed France faster than expected. But inside headquarters, concerns were growing. Staff reports from September and October warned that the army was stretched thin. Fuel lagged behind advances. Ammunition supplies were uneven. Repair units struggled to keep vehicles running. Medical teams were overwhelmed. Many divisions were exhausted. Replacement troops often arrived with little preparation. Some commanders feared the army was becoming overextended. Patton paid little attention. He believed slowing down was more dangerous than moving forward. Tensions inside the command structure increased. Patton's blunt manner caused friction. He criticized other generals openly and dismissed advice he considered too cautious. Internal memoranda recorded disputes over supplies, boundaries, and operational control. Political pressure returned. After hard fighting near Metz in November 1944, officials in Washington began questioning Patton's approach. Some argued speed had come at the cost of stability. Others worried another mistake could revive earlier controversies. Those concerns filtered quietly down the chain of command. Patton noticed. His diary from late 1944 shows growing fatigue. He wrote about poor sleep, constant pain, and mental strain. He worried that support from above was weakening. He also felt isolated. Former allies became cautious. Conversations were guarded. Praise was limited. Mistakes were noted. At the front, the cost was clear. Units that had raced across France were now fighting in cold, muddy conditions against determined German defenses. Winter was approaching. Supplies were thin. Morale shifted daily. Casualties continued to rise. Patton pushed harder. He demanded new offensives. He resisted pauses. He believed momentum was protection. But the strain was obvious. Men were worn down. Equipment was failing. Supply lines were stretched. By December 1944, Third Army was spread thin across a wide front. Intelligence officers reported unusual German troop movements in the Ardennes. Few paid much attention. Patton was focused on pressing forward. The victories had not brought security. They had brought pressure. They had brought scrutiny. They had brought risk. And as winter closed in, another crisis was already taking shape. After the war, George Patton did not fit easily into a single story. To many, he was one of the most effective commanders of World War II. His Third Army's drive across France is still studied for its speed and aggressive leadership. To others, he was reckless and difficult. They pointed to the hospital incident, his public outbursts, and his clashes with authority. Both views are partly true. Later records and historians show something more complicated. One of Patton's most important contributions may not have been a battle he fought, but a role he played without fully realizing it. For nearly a year, he was kept out of real command, not because he was useless, but because he was useful in another way. His reputation became a tool. German commanders feared him. Allied planners understood that fear and used it. His sidelining, visibility, and frustration were part of a system designed to mislead the enemy. While Patton believed he was being punished, the system was using him. And it worked. When he returned to command, it was not because everything was forgiven, but because the moment required his leadership. After the war, Patton never fully made peace with that. His diaries show pride mixed with resentment. He believed he had been treated unfairly, even as he knew open resistance would have ended his career. What saved him was not confrontation. It was restraint. He survived not by fighting the system, but by learning when to endure it. That complicates the legend. Patton's story is not only about courage or mistakes, it is about power. Large institutions do not reward talent alone. They reward people who can be managed. They tolerate exceptional figures only when they can be controlled. Patton did not survive betrayal by confronting it. He survived by absorbing it, by waiting, by mastering himself when he could not control the system around him. And that may be his lasting legacy.